So today we're going to conclude the story of Joseph, as well as our series on the Patriarchs, which we've been in for a really long time, the majority of this year. So we're finally concluding this. And as we come to the end of the book of Genesis, we're going to discover that there's a connection between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Genesis. And I think that this connection is purposeful. I think this connection reveals something big about God, who he is, what he's like, and what he's up to in our world. So as we begin, let's first of all think about this. I have this question for you. Who was Genesis written to, and what was the context? Let's think about that for a second. Who was it written to, and what was the context? This is really important. Now, I bring this up every now and then. It's a good reminder. It's a good reminder for us that the Bible is not written to us. It's not written to us. It's definitely for us, but it wasn't written to us. There were human authors, human contributors, writing in a particular time, in a particular place, to a particular people, in a particular language, to communicate a particular message. We have to keep that in mind. So we don't know exactly when and where Genesis was written, but many believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So when it comes to Genesis specifically, with the story of creation, all the way up through the stories of the patriarchs that we've been studying over the past several months, Moses didn't have a firsthand knowledge of these events, right? He obviously didn't experience these things. He wasn't there. He wasn't alive. So we believe that God revealed these things to Moses. And then Moses recorded these things, wrote these things down. And the main purpose of God's revelation wasn't necessarily to reconstruct events, record history, or even tell these family stories of the patriarchs. The main purpose of this revelation was to communicate something about himself. That's so key, something about himself, who he is, what he's like, and what he's up to in our world. And that's what the author, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is trying to communicate. And so, once again, Moses began writing these things down, recording this revelation, and then passing it on orally to the people of Israel soon after their exodus from Egypt, probably during their time at Mount Sinai, probably, in the wilderness as they're headed to the promised land. So let's keep all that in mind. Now, up to that point, the Israelite people, maybe they had some oral traditions passed down from generation to generation to generation, about, their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Maybe they heard some of those stories passed down from generation to generation. We're not really sure. But even so, they probably knew very little about Yahweh. Probably knew very, very little about the one true God, the Creator God. Remember, they were in an ancient Near Eastern context. And the people of Israel spent hundreds of years enslaved in Egypt. So they were probably more familiar with the pagan gods of that day. They were probably very familiar with the Egyptian gods and what those gods were like. And so what they knew of the gods, at least what they were taught about the gods, was that human beings were created to care for the needs of the gods. That's why human beings were alive, to care for the needs of the gods. That's why they had to sacrifice, and that's why they had to offer food offerings and drink offerings. It was to provide for the gods. Do the gods' bidding. Serve the gods. And the gods, what they believed, what they were taught, is that the gods were very fickle, very easily offended. If you ticked off the gods, you better watch out. So any kind of natural disaster or any kind of catastrophe or a disease that someone had must mean that someone upset the gods in some way. Any kind of suffering, if you're going through anything bad in your life, it was probably because you offended the gods in some way. You're probably being punished. In fact, if you think about it, people still believe some of these things today, right? Now, remember, the Israelites, they had been experiencing suffering for a long time, right? Think about their experience in Egypt. So what could their ancestors have done? What did they deserve? What did they do to deserve such punishment? Then along comes Moses. And this is just incredible to think about. And God not only called Moses to deliver the people of Israel from Egypt, but to help establish this covenant relationship with them. Relationship? A covenant relationship? I mean, that's different. I mean, the pagan gods would never want any kind of relationship with human beings. And then to give them God's law, to clearly communicate what God desired for them. Wow, that is so different from what they knew. And then also communicate this revelation of God. This is who God is. This is what He's like. This is what He's up to. No more second guessing. Can you imagine that? And this is the revelation of God that they would have received. It all started in the beginning with one God, the Creator God, and His work of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. This would have communicated something very specific to the Israelite people. Formless and empty. The earth was formless and empty. In the Hebrew, this phrase rhymes. It's tohu vavohu. That's kind of a fun phrase to say. Tohu vavohu. And it's translated in many different ways. Right here, as I read, it's formless and empty. Some translations will say formless and void. Other ways of translating it is wild and waste. So wild and waste, formless and void, formless and empty, darkness over the face of the deep. What is being described here is dark, chaotic, a dark, chaotic, non-ordered world. A world without meaning, a world without purpose. That's the point of tohu vavohu. And what follows then, and most of us are very familiar with what follows in Genesis chapter 1, is just this incredibly beautiful picture of God bringing meaning and purpose and order from the chaos. So on day one, God separates the light from the darkness. He calls the light day, and the darkness He calls night. So what's happening here? It's the creation of time, bringing order. It's the creation of time. Day number 2, God separates the water above from the waters below. He's creating a space for life to exist, bringing order to creation. On day 3, the land appears with trees and plants bearing seeds for food to grow, for the sustenance of life, for the flourishing of life, so life can actually happen. I mean, this is just incredible, and I'm not going to go through the days of creation. We've studied these before, but it's just incredibly beautiful. It's just a very beautiful picture. And what does God say about all this? It was good. He says it over and over in chapter 1. It was good. It was good. It was very good. And the Hebrew word for good is such a rich word. Such a rich word. It's tov. T-O-V, tov. A very rich word. It means good, beautiful, right. So when something is tov, it means that it's working in the way it was intended to work. When something is tov, it's fulfilling the divine purpose for which it was created. Isn't that beautiful? That's tov. That's good. That's goodness. So can you imagine the Israelites hearing this for the first time? I mean, I kind of picture them sitting around campfires talking about it and talking about it with their kids and their families. And I can remember, or I can picture, Moses, at the base of Mount Sinai teaching these things to the people. You mean God created a world where everything is supposed to work in such a way for the good and flourishing of life? You mean we weren't created to meet the needs of the gods, but to have a relationship with the Creator God? You mean this world was created for our good? Man, that's incredible. That's a good God. That's a really, really good God. And that's so different from anything that they would have known. But that's not all. We were created in the image of this God, of the Creator God, which means that we were created to partner with Him by upholding His order and bringing about His order, by reflecting His goodness and bringing about more goodness on the earth. This was our purpose. This is what we were created for. Such meaning and purpose to life. We're supposed to be people of Tov, people of God's goodness. Wow, can you imagine them hearing this in the midst of the world that they lived in? But I also can imagine the Israelites saying, that's not been our experience. What you're describing here has not been our experience. We've come from an experience in Egypt that looks more like the dark, chaotic, non-ordered world in the beginning. A world void of meaning, void of purpose. So then Moses would go on to tell them about Adam and Eve. How Adam and Eve tried to order things around themselves, and how they tried to find meaning in their own way instead of God's way, and how they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Tov and Ra. Ra is the Hebrew word for evil. It means dysfunctional, not working as God intends for it to work. It's the opposite of Tov. And this lack of trust in their Creator unleashed Ra upon the world, plunging God's good world, God's good creation back into non-ordered chaos. And so now we're not only aware of evil and non-goodness, we not only have the knowledge of it, but human beings can experience evil, can experience Ra, and human beings now can actually participate in the evil. And that's why there's a lack of Tov. And this would have made perfect sense to the Israelites. I mean, it explained their experience, as well as many of the experiences of the patriarchs. Because it seems that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and their families, they experienced and they participated in more Ra moments than Tov moments, right? I mean, that's what it seems as we've gone throughout this series, that they've experienced and participated in more Ra moments than Tov moments. And the Israelites especially could have related to the Joseph story. Think about it. Joseph was sent to Egypt as a slave. All the evil and injustice that he went through. And so, in the very last verse of Genesis, we finally arrived. Very last chapter of Genesis, chapter 50. We learn that Jacob had just passed away. And so now, Joseph's brothers, they're afraid. They think that now that their father's passed away, now that their father's out of the picture, that Joseph is finally going to take his revenge on them. He's finally going to get revenge. But here's what Joseph says. And this would have been an incredible revelation to the Israelites of who God is and what He's up to in the world. So very different from the vindictive gods that they had been taught about, the fickle gods of Egypt. Genesis chapter 50, starting with verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. You intended evil. You intended Ra. But God intended it for good." God intended it for Tov. "To accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Through all that mess Joseph went through, all the evil that was intended for Joseph, God was at work. God was at work. And so Genesis ends the way it began, with God bringing Tov, God bringing goodness, beauty, order, purpose, meaning from darkness, from chaos, from non-order, from meaninglessness. That's what God did for Joseph. And that's what God did for the Israelites when he delivered them from Egypt. And God delivered them so that they could not only experience his goodness, but also, like Joseph, be reflections of his goodness to the ends of the earth. But here's the thing. Just like we've seen throughout this series with the patriarchs, if you continue to read throughout the Old Testament, what do you see? What do you read? The people of Israel, it seems, participated in more Ra moments than Tov moments. Just like Adam and Eve, they failed over and over and over again to be reflections of God's goodness. Even so, even in the midst of all that, God was still at work. And Jesus arrives on the scene. Light in the midst of darkness, Tov in the midst of Ra, and he was the only one that could get it right. God himself came to show us the way to be, the way to live. In the midst of all the Ra, Jesus came, the perfect reflection of the Creator. And he began announcing what? He began announcing the good news of his kingdom. Tov. It's a kingdom characterized by Tov. It's a kingdom characterized by goodness. And this is what we need to be reminded of today. I know I do. I need to be reminded of this every day, each and every day, moment by moment, that Jesus came to transform every area of our world. He came to transform every part of creation, starting in the hearts of people. Taking what is wild and waste, taking what is a dark, chaotic, non-ordered, dysfunctional mess and turning it into something good and beautiful and right. Something full of meaning and purpose. What it was intended for all along. In a couple of weeks, we're going to begin our Christmas series, which once again, it's hard to believe that we're coming up on the Christmas season this quickly. And our Christmas series is going to be called Good News of Great Joy, and we're going to be talking about the stories that we tell. What story are we telling? What story are we demonstrating? Is it a story of good news, of great joy? We'll be talking more about this here in the coming weeks. But as I wrap this up today, as we wrap the series up, I just want us to spend some time in prayer and reflection. And I have some questions. I have several questions that I'm going to bring up on the screen, and I just want us to spend time with these questions. And the first one is this. Have you experienced God's goodness in your life? Have you experienced God's goodness in your life? If so, just spend some quiet moments right now thinking about what he's done for you. Think about his goodness and praise him for it. Thank him for it. If you haven't experienced his goodness, or not really sure, or you haven't experienced the good news, all it takes is trust. Trust in his goodness. Trust in what he has done in his son Jesus. And then turning from your way, turning from your non-ordered, chaotic way of living and turn towards his way, his way of purpose and meaning. Spend some time thinking, praising, reflecting. Where in your life are you experiencing a lack of goodness? Where are you experiencing non-order, chaos, evil? Ask God to take what's wild and waste and dark and chaotic and dysfunctional and turn it into something good, beautiful, and right. Pray for those things now. Where in our world do you see a lack of goodness? It's all around us, right? Ask God to take what is wild and waste, what is dark, chaotic, and dysfunctional, and turn it into something good, beautiful, and right. I have one last question that I want us to reflect on, but before we get to that question, I want you to look up here for a second. Before we continue along that line, I want you to read a verse with me on the screen that's a very familiar verse. In fact, most of us probably know this verse. Many of us know it by memory. Will you read this with me? And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In all things, he works for the good of those who love him. An incredible verse, right? This is a verse that we put on our coffee mugs and on our bumper stickers and on our t-shirts. A verse we memorize, and it's a great verse. It's great to know that God works for my good and that God works for your good. God works for the good of those who love him. However, I think what Paul is communicating here is something way bigger than that. You may notice, if you have your Bibles with you, you may notice there's a little footnote there next to this verse. And that's because there are a couple Greek words in this verse that are very, very difficult for translators to translate. And so there are a couple different ways to translate this verse. Many scholars believe that what Paul is really saying here is this. And we know that in all things God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good, with those who have been called according to his purpose. Let me read that again. And we know that in all things God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good, with those who have been called according to his purpose. And I think that makes a lot more sense in light of God's big plan and purpose for his creation. And I think that makes a lot more sense in light of Genesis, how we were created in his image to partner with God by upholding his order and bringing about his order and reflecting his goodness and bringing about goodness. And I think this makes a lot more sense to me in light of Joseph's story. I mean, when you think about, Joseph and what God was accomplishing, yes, for Joseph and for Joseph's good, but also what God was accomplishing with Joseph for the good of his brothers and the good of his family as Joseph returned Tov for Ra, good for evil. And God worked in the midst of Joseph's chaos to bring about salvation for many lives. And we've talked about this before. this is really important. Joseph wasn't just a passive observer in God's goodness. You know, he was an active participant. God was working with Joseph, alongside Joseph, bringing good from evil, bringing order from chaos in Potiphar's house, in the prison, in the land of Egypt, and beyond, all the earth. In fact, this is how God continues to work in our world. This is how God continues to take what is wild and waste, what is dark and chaotic, what is non-ordered and dysfunctional, and turns it into something good and beautiful and right. Something with meaning, something with purpose. This is how God's kingdom is advancing, his kingdom of Tov, his kingdom of goodness. This is how God is transforming every area of our world and every area of his creation, starting in the hearts of his people. So, we know that in all things God works together with those who love him to bring about what is good, with those who have been called according to his purpose. So as we continue to pray and reflect, here's the final question. How are you being a reflection of God's goodness? Are you a person of Tov? How are you being a reflection of God's goodness in your relationships, in your conversations, in the way you take the opportunity to point the way to Jesus and to share the good news, the Tov news of what Jesus has done for you, to talk about it and to demonstrate it in your life? God is continuing his good work. His work of Tov. He's continuing to bring Tov from Ra. And he has an ultimate plan, an ultimate purpose for his creation. And it includes you. And it includes me. And it includes this church. It includes his universal church. We are active participants in this. So, how are you being a reflection of God's goodness? Spend some time thinking and praying about that. This morning, as we've been doing every week, we're going to remember the Lord's Supper. We're going to remember his sacrifice for us. And we're going to remember that on the cross, Jesus accomplished the greatest good in the face of the greatest evil, bringing Tov from Ra. And that's God's greatest work. That's God's greatest work. Through their sin, Adam and Eve plunged all creation back into chaos. But through his resurrection, Jesus unleashed new creation. And it was good. And it is good.